The desert stretched out endless and golden under the afternoon sun, and Sarah knelt there in the dry grass with her hands trembling and her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. She was 23 years old and she had made so many mistakes, and now here she was at the end of everything with nowhere left to run and no one left to turn to. The man standing before her was maybe 60 years old, with weathered skin and kind eyes that had seen a lifetime of desert summers and hard winters, and he wore a tan shirt with a red bandana around his neck and a hat that had shaded him through decades of work. His name was Thomas Mitchell, and he had been ranching this land for 35 years, and he had seen many things in his time but nothing quite like this. Sarah looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, and she said those words that would stay with him forever. "Just make it quick please," she cried. Thomas felt his mouth fall open and he took a step back because he suddenly understood what this young woman thought was about to happen. She thought he meant to hurt her. She thought this was the end. He knelt down quickly in the dust beside her and held up both hands and said, "No, no, child, no," and his voice was gentle like a father speaking to a frightened daughter. Sarah blinked at him, confused and scared and still trembling. "I'm not going to hurt you," Thomas said, and he kept his voice soft and steady and calm because he could see she was like a wild animal backed into a corner and ready to bolt or break. She stared at him trying to understand, and he could see the fear slowly giving way to confusion. "What were you running from?" Thomas asked. Sarah's lip quivered and she looked away across the desert toward the mountains in the distance, and she said everything. Thomas waited because he knew that sometimes people need silence before they can find their words. "I made mistakes," she said finally, and her voice was so small and broken that it hurt his heart to hear it, "and I kept making more mistakes trying to fix the first ones, and now I owe money to people who don't forgive debts, and I lost my job and my apartment, and I thought if I could just get far enough away maybe I could start over, but my car broke down 30 miles back and I've been walking for 2 days. Thomas listened and he thought about his own daughter Rebecca, who was about Sarah's age and lived in Phoenix now with a good husband and 2 beautiful children, and he thought about how easily life could go wrong for anyone and how grace was something everyone needed but not everyone received. "Come on," he said, and he stood up and offered her his hand. Sarah looked at his hand like it might be a trick. "Come on back to the house," Thomas said, "and you can get cleaned up and have something to eat and we'll figure out what comes next." "Where's your house?" Sarah asked. "About 2 miles that way," Thomas pointed, "and I've got a truck parked just over that rise and we can ride back." Sarah took his hand and he helped her to her feet, and she swayed a little because she was exhausted and dehydrated and probably hadn't eaten properly in days. Thomas steadied her and then he walked her slowly up the small hill to where his old pickup truck sat baking in the sun, and he helped her into the passenger seat and gave her a bottle of water from the cooler in the back. "Drink slow," he said, "or you'll get sick." She nodded and sipped the water, and he could see her hands were still shaking. They drove back to the ranch in silence except for the rumble of the engine and the sound of tires on the dirt road, and Sarah stared out the window at the landscape rolling by, and Thomas wondered what she was thinking. The ranch house was simple and sturdy with white paint and blue shutters and a porch that wrapped around the front, and when they pulled up, Thomas saw his wife Martha come to the door. Martha was 58 years old with silver hair pulled back in a bun, and she wore a floral dress and an apron, and when she saw Sarah climbing out of the truck she knew immediately that something was wrong. Thomas walked Sarah up to the porch and Martha met them with concern in her eyes. "This is Sarah," Thomas said, "and she needs our help." Martha didn't ask questions and she simply opened the door wider and said, "Come in, dear, and let's get you comfortable." Inside the house it was cool and quiet and smelled like bread baking, and Sarah felt something break loose inside her chest because it had been so long since she had felt safe. Martha led her to the bathroom and gave her clean towels and a robe and said, "Take your time, honey, and there's soap and shampoo and everything you need." Sarah stood in the bathroom alone and looked at herself in the mirror and hardly recognized the person staring back, and she turned on the shower and stepped under the hot water and finally let herself cry, the kind of crying that comes from deep in the soul where all the pain lives. When she came out 20 minutes later wearing the robe with her hair wet and clean, Martha had set out clothes for her and a simple blue dress that had belonged to their daughter and some sandals. In the kitchen, Thomas sat at the table drinking coffee, and when Sarah appeared he smiled and said, "You look better." Martha had made lunch and there were sandwiches and fruit and more water, and Sarah sat down and ate slowly because her stomach had forgotten what real food felt like. They didn't press her for details and they didn't ask uncomfortable questions, and they just let her be there and eat and rest and feel human again. After lunch, Martha showed Sarah to the guest room and said, "You can stay here as long as you need and we'll talk about everything later, but right now you should sleep." Sarah looked at the bed with its clean white sheets and the window with curtains moving gently in the breeze, and she felt tears come again. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked. Martha smiled and touched Sarah's cheek and said, "Because everyone deserves kindness, dear, and because I hope if my daughter was ever in trouble someone would help her too." Sarah slept for 14 hours straight, and when she woke up the sun was rising and the room was filled with golden light, and for the first moment in months she felt peace. Over the next few days Sarah stayed at the ranch and helped Martha with cooking and cleaning, and she helped Thomas with some of the lighter work around the property, and slowly she began to feel like herself again. Thomas and Martha learned her story in pieces, and they learned about the boyfriend who had gotten her involved in bad decisions and the debts that piled up and the way everything collapsed all at once. They didn't judge and they didn't lecture, and they just listened and offered quiet wisdom when it seemed right. One evening they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and purple, and Thomas said, "You know, I made plenty of mistakes when I was young." Sarah looked at him surprised. "I got mixed up with the wrong people," Thomas continued, "and I drank too much and I nearly threw away everything that mattered, and it was only because someone gave me a chance that I found my way back." "Who gave you a chance?" Sarah asked. "An old rancher named William Carter," Thomas said, "and he hired me when nobody else would, and he taught me about hard work and responsibility, and he never once made me feel ashamed of my past, and he told me that every day was a chance to be better than yesterday." Sarah felt something shift inside her and she said, "I don't know if I can be better." Thomas looked at her and said, "You already are, and you're here and you're trying, and that's what matters." Martha came out with glasses of lemonade and sat down beside them and said, "We've been talking, Sarah, and we'd like to offer you something." Sarah waited and felt her heart beat faster. "We need help around here," Martha said, "and Thomas isn't getting any younger, though he won't admit it, and if you wanted to stay and work with us we could pay you a fair wage and you'd have room and board and time to figure out your next steps." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks and she said, "I don't deserve this." "You don't have to deserve kindness," Thomas said gently, "and you just have to accept it." Sarah stayed, and the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, and slowly she began to rebuild herself. She learned to ride horses and mend fences and help with the cattle, and she learned to bake bread and tend the garden and fix broken things. More importantly, she learned that mistakes didn't define her and that running away never solved anything, but standing still and facing the truth and accepting help could change everything. Thomas taught her about patience and Martha taught her about grace, and together they showed her what family could mean even when it wasn't bound by blood. One afternoon 6 months after she arrived, Sarah was working in the garden when a car pulled up the drive, and her heart seized with fear because she thought maybe the people she owed had found her. But when the car door opened, it was a woman about her age with 2 small children, and Sarah recognized her from photos as Rebecca, the daughter. Thomas came out of the barn and his face lit up, and he called out Becca and walked over to embrace his daughter. Rebecca hugged him and then looked past him to where Sarah stood frozen in the garden. Thomas waved Sarah over and said, "Rebecca, I want you to meet Sarah, and she's been helping us out here and she's become part of our family." Rebecca smiled warmly and shook Sarah's hand and said, "It's nice to meet you, and Dad's told me about you." Sarah felt surprise and nervousness and she said, "He has." Rebecca nodded and said, "He told me how you've been such a help and how much you've brought life back to this place and how proud he is of the work you've done." Sarah looked at Thomas and saw him smiling, and she felt something warm and whole bloom in her chest. That evening they all had dinner together, and Rebecca's children ran around the yard playing and laughing, and Sarah watched them and felt grateful for this life she never expected to find. After dinner, Sarah and Rebecca sat on the porch steps while the children caught fireflies, and Rebecca said, "You know, my parents don't usually take in strangers." Sarah nodded and said, "I know, and I'm grateful every day." Rebecca looked at her and said, "My dad told me you were running from something." Sarah tensed, but Rebecca continued gently and said, "He also told me you stopped running, and that takes real courage." They sat in comfortable silence, and then Rebecca said, "When I was 19 I got pregnant and I wasn't married, and I was so scared and I didn't know what to do, and my parents could have been disappointed or angry, but instead they supported me and helped me figure things out, and they taught me that love isn't conditional." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Rebecca said, "That's why they helped you, and because they know what grace looks like and they want to pass it on." The next morning when Rebecca and her family left, Sarah hugged her and felt like she was hugging a sister. Time continued to pass, and Sarah saved her money and paid off her debts little by little, and she started taking online classes to finish her degree, and she began to dream about a future that felt possible. Thomas turned 65 that winter and Martha threw him a party and people came from all over the county and Sarah met neighbors and friends and other ranchers and she realized she was part of a community. One of the guests was a young man named David who worked at the feed store and he was kind and funny and he asked Sarah if he could call on her sometime. Sarah said yes and her heart felt light. Spring came and the desert bloomed and Sarah stood in the same spot where Thomas had found her a year before and she looked out at the endless sky and thought about how far she had traveled. Thomas came up beside her and said, "What are you thinking?" Sarah smiled and said, "I'm thinking about second chances." Thomas nodded and said, "Those are the best kind because you appreciate them more." Sarah turned to him and said, "I want to thank you for everything and for saving my life." Thomas shook his head gently and said, "I didn't save your life, Sarah, and you did that yourself and I just gave you a place to rest while you figured it out." "But why?" Sarah asked, "and why did you help me when you didn't know me?" Thomas looked out at the desert and was quiet for a long moment and then he said, "Because a long time ago someone helped me and because kindness isn't about what people deserve and it's about what we can give and because in this hard world we have to take care of each other." Sarah reached out and hugged him and he hugged her back and she whispered, "Thank you." They stood there together in the desert wind and the sun warm on their faces and Sarah knew that she would spend the rest of her life trying to pass on the grace she had been given. Years later when Sarah had her own place and her own family she would tell her children about the day she knelt in the desert ready to give up and about the rancher who saw past her fear and offered kindness instead of judgment. She would teach them that everyone has a story and everyone deserves compassion and that sometimes the smallest act of grace can change the entire direction of a life. And when her children asked her what the most important thing in life was she would smile and say it's choosing kindness and even when it's hard and even when people don't deserve it and especially then. Because kindness isn't just something you do she would tell them and it's something you become and it ripples out into the world in ways you'll never fully see. And somewhere in the desert an old ranch still stands with white paint and blue shutters and a porch where people sit in the evenings and watch the sunset and talk about grace and second chances and the quiet courage it takes to accept help when you need it most.